Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I think I've got my mic turned on.
I forgot to tell you she came from Texas for this occasion.
Exactly, yes. I delightfully came from Texas. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And this is a really wonderful show that I've only had a chance myself to look at briefly, but there's a lot here. And it's a really terrific subject, so it's a great opportunity to think a little bit more about some of the work that I've looked at very intensely in the HLW archives. There's one other thank you that I'd like to make, actually, which is to, and they're not here, but they will hear me thanking them from afar, to Ted Hammer and Keith Hanadel of HLW, who I've worked with across the past 10 years or so with their corporate archive, and we have just a few things from their archive for the New York Times building here in this show. And without their support and letting me pilfer through their thousands and thousands and thousands of boxes, really none of this would be possible. They have one of the best corporate archives that remains. It dates all the way back to 1885 up to the present. They have an enormous amount of material, so it's a real treasure trove, and I thank them for their support of me as a historian looking through their things. What I'm here to talk about this evening, though, is the New York Times Tower, which opened with a fireworks display in Times Square on New Year's Eve on December 31st of 1904, and that's what you're seeing depicted here in the newspaper on January 1st of 1905. It was designed by the architect Cyrus Eidlitz and his partner Andrew Mackenzie for the Times publisher Adolph Ochs, and the tower redefined the landscape of the newspaper industry and the city itself. And can I have the next slide? Today it is probably one of the most photographed buildings in the world, the centerpiece every New Year's Eve of a corporatized massive entertainment as the giant ball slowly drops, marking another year's advance on the calendar. But in these daily and annual revelries, it is certain that really no one actually considers that the building behind all of these lights is actually the original New York Times building from 1904, which we see here dimly lit up in 1905 on the left and very brilliantly lit up over there on the right in 2007. This is an incredibly rich topic that one can talk about from any number of angles. There have been a lot of books published about the history of the New York Times, about the history of Times Square. But what I want to talk about this evening is actually a very narrow slice, which focuses on probably the most neglected part of the story of Times Square, which is actually the building itself. So that if you look at all of the great books about the New York Times, like The Trust, which was published recently, or books about Times Square Roulette, The Devil's Playground, I'm trying to think of some of the others, Money Jungle, lots and lots of great books to look at. The building actually appears only passingly and is a very small part of the story. One could argue, actually, that the building is in a way irrelevant, abandoned for its purpose as a headquarters for the newspaper within 10 years, and then gutted and reskinned in the 1950s. Can I have the next slide, please? And then now all but forgotten behind its LED panels. So what I'd like to do is think about the way the Times was intended originally, the way that its architects and its patrons intended in this very dramatic moment to change the newspaper industry and to change the city as well. Eidlitz and Mackenzie's tower, which was either the tallest or the second tallest when it was finished in 1905, depending on how you measured, played a pivotal role in shifting the geography of the early 20th century city, and especially in thinking about the way that skyscrapers would redefine the urban experience. The Times paper was designed both to be a vertical beacon, visible like a lighthouse from miles away, and to be a vertical observation tower, allowing the publisher dominion over the vast territories below. In every sense, the Times Tower proclaimed a new era for newspapers and a new era for architecture. And can I have the next slide? And to get at that story, I want to go back just a little bit to Newspaper Row, which is very well documented here, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, where the New York Times had had its offices since 1858. All the major New York newspapers had their homes here for the second half of the 19th century. And of course, the New York Times Tower over here is building all the way over on the right-hand side of Newspaper Row. You can have the next slide. Established in 1851, the Times had its first homes on Nassau Street before moving to a new cast iron front building at 41 Park Row in 1858. The location served the Times well into the 1870s as it became the key force in exposing the corruption of Tammany Hall under Boss Tweed, which earned the paper international status as a source for serious news under editor George Jones. By 1889, the paper needed to expand once more, and it hired the architect George Post to coordinate the remarkable feat of expanding the 5-story building, doubling its size without interrupting the paper's production. And you see a photograph here on the bottom right of that building still producing the newspapers, people still working inside, and the building doubling in height all around it. Staying put in the heart of Newspaper Row, and the completed building is very dark up there at the top right. Staying put in this location in the middle of Newspaper Row with all of the other newspaper production was key to survival at this point. But, and can I have the next slide, please? By the early 1890s, some chinks began to show. The New York Herald moved from Newspaper Row to the newly renamed Herald Square at 34th and Broadway. McKim, Mead & White designed the new building based on the model of the Loggia del Consiglio in Verona, which we see here at the bottom center, and the main facade of the Herald building over there on the right. Compared to the towers of Printing House Square, the new Herald building was squat and low, only 2 stories, but it claimed a major public space. And by setting itself apart from the other newspapers with its own small public square at its main facade, the Herald building staked a claim to an independent presence in the city. Can I have the next slide, please? The building also incorporated a new feature that challenged the model of the older newspaper buildings by incorporating a public viewing area for watching the newsroom and the printing presses at work. And you can see people perched up there on the top right, looking through the windows down and watching the newsroom and the printing presses at work. This was the first major reorientation of the news away from its heart on Newspaper Row, and the Herald became part of the expanding city instead of being an appendage of City Hall. This ability to capture the public imagination in a new way provided a major catalyst for the development of the new Times Tower 10 years later. Now, the second major catalyst, if I can have the next slide, please, was Adolph Ochs, shown here on the left, who bought the New York Times in 1896, just hours before the illiquid newspaper was about to be auctioned off. Despite its earlier success, the Times, in part burdened by debt from the construction of its new building, had become a money-losing enterprise with limited circulation. In 1896, when Ochs bought the paper was losing $1,000 a day, and it had a circulation of less than 9,000. Ochs, himself burdened with debt incurred as he expanded his own investment in Chattanooga, where he owned the Chattanooga Times, plunged headfirst into reinvigorating the newspaper almost overnight. Within a year, the paper's respectability was reestablished. And in 1898, when Ochs slashed the price of the daily from 3 cents to 1 cent, the paper surged back to profitability. As the Times surged back, though, it needed more space, and perhaps more importantly, it needed more visibility. To compete with the exponents of yellow journalism, like the Herald, the Journal, and the World, the Times, which intended to be what it called a clean, dignified, and trustworthy news source, it needed to set itself apart. And the poster I'm showing here on the right is from 1896, the year Ochs bought the newspaper, and it advertises the Times as the model of decent and dignified journalism, with this very pure and no doubt quite moralistic lady holding not a gilded lily, a white lily over there on the right. And the slogan, of course, in Latin at the bottom is, "The truth is great and will prevail." Now, Ochs was no stranger to the use of architecture as a symbol of achievement. If I could have the next slide. In 1892, he had opened an extravagant 6-story central office for the Chattanooga Times, which I'm showing you here, complete with a domed observation platform at the corner bay. In New York, the new building would have to be bigger and better than this headquarters. Ox wanted a building to do what he said it needed to wake up the nation and call attention to the Times' resurgence under his leadership. So the location of the new tower was critical to these plans. When investigations of real estate began in 1902, the first sites considered were close to Newspaper Row. One site considered was across City Hall Park on Broadway, which is later the site of the Woolworth Building. Rising real estate costs, though, persuaded Ox to look further afield. And the fact that the Herald had decamped and successfully made its way uptown, making itself an individual center of a busy urban tableau, provided an incentive as well. So I can have the next slide. The final site was a wedge of land at the intersection of Broadway and 42nd Street, occupied by the Pabst Hotel here on the left. The area was known as Long Acre Square, a neighborhood of cheap theaters and cheap hotels, an area known also for being home to handsome cabs. And it was, however, on the brink of a major transformation. The building of the new IRT subway line, with a station at Broadway and 42nd, meant that new businesses and new theaters began to open and operate here, and the Hotel Astor would soon be here within 5 years. And have the next slide, please. So the site offered two key practical advantages for the Times. First was its visibility, as this view of the Times Tower shortly after it was completed in 1905 suggests. Any building built here would be visible in the round from all of its sides, and would be connected to a public space from which people could stand and look at the building, even if it was a very awkward space. And here I should point out that the resulting building is 20 feet wide at this narrow point, and it is 58 feet wide at the back side, and along its longer sides of the wedge, it is 138 feet on the short side and 143 feet on the longer side. So this is a small building, a small footprint, and somewhat awkwardly proportioned. The second advantage, though, and if I could have the next slide, was its potential as a part of this new network of the subway system. What the building attempted to do was connect directly to the subway system through a station that was actually in its basement. For the Times, this offered a new opportunity to create a model of distribution that used the higher speeds the subway offered in order to get the paper out from the printing presses in the basement to the city beyond. And what the Times did from this location was, and I'll just show you, there's this little dog leg here. This is the Broadway and 42nd Street station. That became the nexus. We could have the next slide, from which the Times building and the Times as a newspaper reconceived of the entire geography of New York. And I love this image on the left in particular, in which the Times building in Times Square is the center of this series of radiating circles. There's nothing around it. It is the center of the entire universe. On the right, this is another graphic that was produced for a special supplement to the New York Times that was published on January 1st of 1905, in which, again, we've got Times Square, Times building directly at the center, and every single mode of transportation in the city converges on this building. We've got the buses coming in, we've got the subway, we have trains from Penn Station, we've got the 6th Avenue L. All of these modes of transportation converge at Times Square and converge at the newspaper itself. So the final piece of the puzzle was put in place on April 5th of 1904, when in the midst of construction on the new building, the city aldermen voted to rename Long Acre Square into Times Square in honor of Ox newspaper. The challenge to the Herald's just a few blocks south on Broadway, which again, this is very dark here, but right there in the foreground, you're looking at the Herald building with the Times building coming up just behind it. The challenge here was direct. Both papers had prominent sites, both papers had public space named in their honor, and all that remained was for the new Times building to surpass the Herald. So I could have the next slide. Ox hired Cyrus Eidlitz to design this new building in Times Square. Eidlitz, by 1903, had been in practice for about 30 years, much of that with his father, the often difficult and controversial Leopold Eidlitz. Cyrus's largest commissions were for buildings outside the city, in Chicago and in Buffalo. This is the Dearborn Station in Chicago, over there on the right, which is still there in the city, but without this wonderful tower. And then here on the left, from 1887, is the Buffalo Public Library, which has been demolished. Both of these buildings very much, if we go back, yeah, both of these buildings show Leopold's influence very much in terms of the kind of Romanesque revival details. Eidlitz was not a part of the upper echelon of practitioners in the city by the turn of the century, and it is some ways puzzling why Ochs chose him for the remarkable commission. But one possibility rests with the particular expertise that Eidlitz and his firm offered. If I could have the next slide. In New York, the firm specialized in telephone buildings, buildings that required collaboration of engineers and architects as they worked to integrate the wiring of telephone networks through the buildings and into the subterranean network of utility and subway tunnels that increasingly defined the city. And I'm showing you here 1896 design for Bell Laboratories, which was an Eidlitz design, which is rather mundane in its external appearance, but if you actually look down into what the basement is doing, there's a remarkable network of steam pipes, water pipes, electricity, telephone wiring. It's an intricate mode of connecting a huge amount of technical equipment from the subterranean city and up into the building above. And if I could have the next slide. This is the Metropolitan Telephone Building from 1886, which was the first telephone building in the city, which was occasioned by the fact that in 1885, the city passed laws requiring all of those wires that had been stretching out above the city streets to go below ground. So this is a new building type that, again, as on the right suggests, has a huge amount of infrastructure in its basement that connects the city below to the building above. If I could have the next slide, please. And I did include this. This is what the city looked like before telephone wires were required to be buried underground. And there's a wonderful photograph that I unfortunately couldn't bring, but shows these telephone wires after a snowstorm. And of course, they're tumbling down to the ground. It became a huge problem as infrastructure expanded. And over here on the right, this is a wonderful image from a kind of subway booklet from 1886 that shows the construction of subway tunnels and the concurrent construction of these vaults in which electricity wiring, phone wiring, all of the sewage pipes could be built at the same time that the tunnels move through the city. This is what Eidlitz's firm really specialized in. Okay, next slide. And one more, before I talk too much about subterranean tunnels. There we go. Oh, that's really, I'm sorry for how dark this is, but this is Eidlitz's original sketch for what the New York Times building would look like here on the left. And Montgomery Schuyler, the venerable architecture critic for Architectural Record, wrote at length of Eidlitz's travails in attempting to manage the design of a building that was both practical from a business and technical standpoint, but still offered something new to the sophisticated viewer, which is something that the telephone buildings did not do. Cognizant of the success of Daniel Burnham's Flatiron Building, which had just been finished in 1902, Eidlitz deliberately chose not to design the building all the way to the edges of the envelope, instead avoiding direct comparison between the two by suggesting a triangular building at the base and then a tower that rose upwards. His initial sketches show a tower extending upward at the broad end of the building, gracefully capped with a mansard roof, which we see up there at the top. For Eidlitz, the steeply sloped mansard presented the possibility of fooling the eye from multiple angles. If I could have the next slide. From the varied perspectives of both Broadway and 7th Avenue. Eidlitz works with this concept through to the working drawing stages, and this is one of his drawings on the left. But ultimately, the mansard idea was dropped in favor of a model insisted on by Ochs himself, Giotto's Campanile for the Florence Cathedral. And we see the final design for the tower on the right. The mansard gave way to this awkwardly proportioned square tower that rose an additional 7 stories from the base, plus an observatory, as we will see at the top. Can I have the next slide? The Campanile provided the model for the square tower with castellated corners, and it clearly set the Times Tower apart from the Flatiron Building. And while I have these two images next to each other, one of the other really interesting things here that you can see is that the campanile divides the tower into 5 sections. If I had my pointer, I could show this to you a little bit more effectively, but the Times Tower is also divided into these 5 stacked sections, especially as you move upwards. So the exterior detailing of the tower was extravagant. The bottom 3 stories were granite, and above the building rose in white brick with detail provided by molded terracotta. I have the next slide, please. Eidlitz was well known for his graceful use of molded terracotta ornament. His designs for the Metropolitan Telephone Building had pioneered combed or textured surfaces that provided a play of shadow across the surface of the building. Can I have the next slide? We go one more. By the 1890s, there we go, at the New York Racquet Club and the Fidelity and Casualty Building, which I'm showing you details here, Eidlitz had developed a sculptural deep relief in his building's ornamental details that took full advantage of the malleable qualities of terracotta manufacturing process. And then the next. At the Times Building, the terracotta blocks at the upper stories of the tower were deeply sculpted, providing ornamental detail intended to be visible from the streets far below. Screeching copper gargoyles and patterns, cast iron window frames provided further surface detailing. And all of these forms combined Renaissance and Gothic sensibilities in a boldly eclectic interpretation of the Italian precedent. Taken as a whole, though, the building's dramatically modeled sections didn't quite gel, but they certainly provided the spectacle that Ochs was looking for, dynamically dwarfing the Herald building down the street. Can I have the next slide? So, in its interior, the Times blended the old newspaper building typology with newly developing skyscraper technology. The Times occupied the basement and the first floor, as well as floors 13 to 25. Floors 2 through 12, or 10 stories out of the footprint of the building, were given over to rentable office space, a revenue generator that funded the construction of the building. Can I have the next slide? The trapezoid made for awkward spaces that were difficult to maximize in terms of rental per square foot. We're looking here at the entry footprint, here the first floor, and a typical elevator lobby there on the right. A typical office would have looked something like this here, a little bit cramped and dark, with floors carved out into multiple small cubby holes. And go one more, please. The businesses seemed to like the address in particular because One Times Square was so memorable, and sales offices in particular seem to really like being located here. And I'm showing you here the top right is a Gillette advertisement in Harper's Weekly, in which the sales office very clearly stated it's in the Times Square building. And then the top center of the image on the right, this is an advertisement for Forefather Pure Corn Whiskey, which sounds pretty good, which also had its main sales office located in the Times building. These are really typical kinds of businesses located there. So while this arrangement was somewhat typical for new skyscrapers, the rest of the building was really typical more of a newspaper building. And especially in the basement, you can really see the unique circumstances of the Times Tower. The 2 sub-basements required the coordination of subway engineers with Eidlitz's engineers, including especially Andrew Mackenzie, who became Eidlitz's partner during the construction of the Times building. Mackenzie was a veteran of the telephone buildings and laboratories of the 80s and 90s, and the challenges posed by the heavy printing presses, the dynamos required to run them, the fuel storage, the need for mechanical equipment to bring paper down into the basement, bring printed papers back up. All of these were akin to the kind of laboratory design that Mackenzie was familiar with. But the integration of the functioning subway station into the basement of the building was an entirely new challenge, and the Times Tower became the first to accomplish this integration of infrastructure. The new IRT tracks, actually go back one here, which are shown here on the right, came in from the east and curved towards the north using Broadway underneath the Times Tower. The skyscraper's foundations were designed to cantilever over and past the tunnel and then down into the first sub-basement, which had a separate foundation structure. A cantilevered I-beam about 30 feet long transferred the load over the tunnel's roof. And then beneath the tunnel, the Times foundations burrowed a full 50 feet down to bedrock with footings cushioned in sand, which was designed to address the issues of vibration in the building, both from the printing presses, which we see here in a section at the top left, and from the fact that a train was running through the bottom of the building every few minutes. So can the next one. So the presses and dynamos were located one level down from the subway tunnel, along with a series of pulleys and lifts that allowed rapid movement of paper rolls from the first sub-basement down and then printed newspapers back up. These went to one of either two of distribution nodes, the city delivery room, or the mailing room. City delivery went directly to the subway station, and mailing room newspapers went out to the post office. And this is a detail showing that pulley system, which is right on the very left-hand side of the image at the top, which is designed specifically to bring the papers up and deliver them out to the subway station. If I could have the next slide, please. The arrangement of the other office spaces in the building mirrored the hierarchical arrangement from the old office on Newspaper Row. Circulation and classifieds occupy the lowest levels on 13, and we're starting right here. So there's a division in the building that shows you where the newspaper offices begin. We begin right there. And then we moved upwards to advertising and business offices, and then going up again to the composing offices that took up floors 15 and 16, plus a kind of gallery over the top. And we see the floor plan of the 16th floor composing room with the gallery that was located just above it there. And again, this is located another transition point in the building, moving up and a little bit short here, but right here we have that transition made. And as you continue going up in the building, you get higher within the corporate hierarchy. Beginning on 17, for the tower floors, you had the news staff, then the Sunday news department above them, and then the editorial staff above the Sunday staff, and then Ox himself was on the highest floor on 20. Above 20, you then got to the kind of public spaces, where you had the library next on 21. Then you had the auditorium or the hall where everyone could gather to hear addresses just above that. And then finally, at the very top of the building was the observatory. If I could have the next slide, please. And here's the observatory. The observatory was intended to offer unobstructed views of the city and its surroundings from Connecticut to New Jersey. Ox used the expansive view to symbolize the Times' ability to command its entire territory. And he wrote, "A visitor atop the Times building will be more than 100 feet above Liberty's torch on Bedloe's Island. He may feel assured that nobody within 12 miles to the north will be able to look down upon him here." If I could have the next slide. The building's height, particularly at a location this far north in 1905, made it an instant landmark. While the tower was 363 feet high, which was about 30 feet shy of the height of the Park Row building, which had been completed in 1899, Ox and the Times went to great lengths to suggest that the Times Tower was, in fact, the tallest building in the city. And this is a great diagram, again, from that 1905 paper supplement that showed just that. We have the Times Tower right here, and this diagram is terrific because it shows the building's height relative to sea level. So we have the elevation of where the building is rising there, and if you take into account the height of the land that the Times Tower was built on, it was higher than the Park Row building. And especially if you take into account how deep the foundations went below ground, the Times Tower was definitely higher than the Park Row building. So again, it's one of those relative issues. In Ox's mind, this was really the tallest building in New York. So regardless of all of these kind of statistical shenanigans, it was the building's vertical isolation that made it distinctive and that made its observatory levels so profoundly captivating. And here we have the plan of this wonderful circular observation tower with 4 staircases that lead up so that you can have a view standing outside protected by a balustrade. The city below was distant and Lilliputian, and the Idlets and McKinsey design celebrated the building's status as a new centerpiece in the city. And I also can't help thinking about the relationship between this tower with an outside observation area, 25 stories up, and then the very small diminutive observation tower from Chattanooga up at 6 stories, from just a few years earlier. Urban photography played a key role in legitimizing these new kinds of spatial explorations. Just as photographs of the Grand Canyon thrilled previous generations, the exhilarating sights of the city captivated these new newspaper readers. This is a view down from the top of the Times Tower, which is still kind of makes my stomach a little queasy to look all the way straight down the corner pier of the building. We also have, and there are a couple of movies here that I tried to embed in my presentation but aren't going to play. But if you have a moment, it's really worthwhile watching. There's a 1905 panoramic film that was taken from the top of the Times Tower explicitly to reinforce this idea that the isolated tower gave a kind of visual dominance over the city below. This is a panoramic view with New York Public Library directly here where I'm pointing, that looked towards the north and the west from the top of the Times Tower. If we have the next one. And this is this film that if you go to the monitor over here or over around the corner, we'll be able to watch. We can just skip past it. It's okay. But nighttime views from and of the Times Tower quickly became an essential component of the Times Square experience. By 1910, only 5 years after the building was completed, the Municipal Art Commission had begun a public campaign to fix the problems of what they called, and I'm quoting here, unsightly buildings and offensive electric advertisements in the Times Square area. And this is actually an image, an advertisement from 1910 that shows an airplane, I hope you can see up at the top, projecting an image onto the face of a building advertising White Rock, where time takes no toll from him who takes White Rock. Theaters increasingly lit up their marquees, and adjacent buildings took up the challenge. And this is a view from 1929, looking north from the Times building. And there's a really wonderful set of essays that were written in 1912 by Pierre Loti, who was a French novelist and a playwright who visited New York while he was doing a production of The Daughter of Heaven with Sarah Bernhardt at the Century Theater. And he had a special visit to the top of the Times Tower, where he went up in an express elevator at night to view the city. And he wrote this wonderful series of essays, and I just want to read one short passage to suggest how important changes in the city as viewed from the Times Tower really were. And he wrote, "Seen from here, the city looks infinitely large. As far as the eye can reach, electricity traces zigzags, palpitates, winks, dazzles, and finally toward the horizon merges in a diffused glow as of the aurora borealis. Never before has New York seemed to me so unmistakably the capital of modernism. Viewed at night from a height like this, she fascinates and frightens." And this is a really wonderful evocation of the whole purpose of the tower itself. It's the centerpiece of a completely new experience of the city itself. So Loti's evocative prose points us toward the final point I'd like to make this evening, which is that the building's true success came in its role as a beacon, a physical and visual gathering point for the rest of the city. While the Art Commission and other concerned citizens may have decried the increased electrification of Times Square, the tower was always intended to serve not just as an observation tower, but as a visual icon, something to be observed. In November 1904, for example, which is before the building was even finished, the paper announced that it would use a searchlight mounted on its top to announce election results. A light shining to the west meant a victory for Roosevelt. A light shining to the east meant a victory for Parker, north for Higgins, south for Herrick, and there was this whole other complicated combination of possible light patterns that I won't even go into. But it was those lights visible from everywhere from the top of the tower that you could read as news itself. And And if you go back one, actually, this image at the bottom left shows the Times Tower from a year later actually projecting the results of an election. And I have no idea what the L pattern actually means, who won there. The tower was designed to be electrified, to have billboards and signs mounted on its exterior. Even when there was no election going on, it was brightly lit at night, as the image on the left, which is from 1920, suggests, visible high above the low neighborhoods surrounding it. And I can have the next slide, please. In some ways, this was simply a continuation of the traditions established by the newspapers back on Newspaper Row. People gathered in the park to wait for election returns, and this is an image from Frank Leslie's newspaper from 1899. The election returns were displayed on signs on the outside of the newspaper buildings. When the new century arrived at midnight on the morning of January 1st, 1900, Ox was in the New York Times building, back on Park Row, with his daughter Iphigene. Together they watched all the lights on City Hall and the surrounding newspaper buildings go dark in anticipation of the chiming of midnight. When the new century arrived, the lights flashed, fireworks filled the sky, and the newspaper buildings were the foci of public events and these kinds of public celebrations. You have the next slide, please. Ox and the Times used its new building to shift the focus of those public events away from City Hall, away from this unified storefront of news organizations and towards itself as an independent presence in the city. And here is a motor car race from 1908, which started at the Times Tower and went all the way to Alaska. Over there on the right, this kind of fuzzy images shows people waiting outside the Times Tower to see who won the World Series. These were the kind of events that began to happen around the Times Tower and Times Square. In this sense, the building was a resounding success. And on New Year's Eve of 1907, of course, leading into 1908, the Times started its new tradition, allowing an electrically lit ball to drop from the top of its flagpole to mark the start of the new year. And as the papers went to press that morning, the front page described the previous evening's aftermath. When the last edition of the Times started toward the press, it all looked just about as it would on any other night, except that there lay in the streets broken horns, demolished and cast aside rattlers, soiled confetti, forlorn ticklers, and dented and deserted derby hats. Which is, I think, the one thing that feels a little bit different about that description. So while the Times moved into larger quarters by 1913, and the Times Annex section of the exhibit here makes that very clear, especially because it needed more space for its presses. And the building was ignominiously sold to Allied Chemical and reclad by Voorhees, Walker, Smith & Smith in 1963. And I should point out that the firm that actually reclad the building, and we go across here from the top, from the Times, being de-skinned and then being reclad in this plain white marble. Voorhees, Walker, Smith & Smith was actually the successor firm to Cyrus Eidlitz's firm. So his own firm took the building apart and turned it into the Allied Chemical Tower. It's been reclad. The observation tower is no longer open. The subway station is closed. The Times doesn't occupy the building anymore. You can make a whole list of things that seem to suggest that the building actually is something of a failure. But on the other hand, it's a remarkable case study in the power of media to focus our attention through an amalgam of public space, public events, and architecture in ways that certainly Eidlitz and Mackenzie could never have anticipated, but which their tower nonetheless accommodates. And I'd like to close with, if you could switch to that video of the Allied Chemical Tower. I'd like to suggest that this video clip brings all of these questions into full play. And this is an advertisement for the new Allied Chemical Tower. Once all of the ornament of the Times Tower had been removed and the building had been recreated. And of course, we go through the whole litany of the sites of New York, which would be pretty much the same today. And you're supposed to see the Allied Chemical Tower. which is portrayed as this incredibly modern structure within the heart of the city. With a series of public exhibition spaces on the ground floor that highlighted all of the new inventions associated with allied chemical, plastics especially. And it's this shot that I find really interesting, which is that it's still the tower in the center of the city. The city has grown up all around the tower, but it remains a gleaming white object within the public space of Times Square. And nothing about the Allied Chemical Tower would have been possible without the fact that it had been the Times building in the first place. Because Adolph Ochs and the New York Times transformed the entire city through the building of a single tower. And we could debate, again, whether or not Cyrus Idless's design was entirely aesthetically successful. But in a way, it was beside the point, because the newspaper building was a critical tool for reshaping the entire city and creating a visual focal point for that new city. Thank you.
We'll turn the lights on and see if the audience has questions.
Okay. And if we want, we can watch the film instead of going around the corner.
Yeah,
it's right.
It's on the videos, on 2 video screens.
Okay.
Exhibition, so probably the projections will be a little clearer.
Maybe clear.
I don't care. I mean, people may want to watch it. It's only 2 minutes, so you want to watch it? Yeah, let's go again.
Who owns the building now?
You know, I don't know who owns the building now, but I can say that, you know, it's got the Walgreens in the bottom, and the kind of big impediment to redeveloping it is the amount of asbestos that's in the building.
Oh, really?
Or that's the story that I am told in talking to especially the folks at HLW about the building.
When did Allied move out? They weren't there very long.
They weren't there very long, and I don't have the exact date there, but they were not there long. It did not become a #1 tourist destination in Times Square, surprisingly. But I think the contrast between that representation of the building and this representation of the building, something rising above everything else, really makes its transformation clear. And we start here, again, at the New York Public Library, and gradually, slowly move.
Were any pieces of the terracotta saved, or not? Or?
Carol has seen one of the gargoyles, right?
It's not terracotta.
It's one of the copper.
And I think only one survived, and it's in the New York Times building. It's a decorative feature out there, of course.
But the terracotta appears not to have survived.
The gargoyles in the New York Historical Society, up on the 4th floor.
There's one there as well.
Is there one there?
Yeah. Where's the other one?
In the New York, the ones from the New York Times is in their new building.
Yeah, the one in the New York Historical Society is on display on the 4th floor.
Oh, I haven't seen it there. Okay.
But in a sense, doesn't the building kind of become superfluous? The city keeps moving. The way we understand New York City is, you know, the center used to be 14th Street, then it moved up to Flatiron, then it moved up to Herald Square, and then moved up to Times Square. And with all the import of what happened there, and I wonder if the IRT subway was planned to go there because of even the newspaper. But at that point, it gets frozen. It never moves north again. I mean, Rockefeller Center and other things happen, but it's still Times Square. The idea becomes bigger than the building, in a sense. And then everything else happens. Then the Broadway phenomena, and I keep thinking of that iconographic photo of the nurse kissing the sailor at the end of World War II. And we all associate that with Times Square. It's a world phenomenon.
Well, I think the thing that I find really interesting, and I think we could have a debate about this, but none of that would have happened without the tower actually being there. Because if you think about Herald Square with that 2-story building, it was the center of public space, but it didn't have the same kind of transformative power that the Times Tower did. You could tie in the relative power of the newspapers. I mean, you could get into a lot of issues, but I think that the building itself played a really critical role in making the transformation of that space possible, because it was tall, it was an icon, and it really supported that geographical transformation. Yeah.
Was it the tallest building in Midtown?
Yes, it was the tallest building. It was the second tallest building, so it was definitely the tallest building.
The tallest building at that point?
The tallest building is back on Newspaper Row, is the Park Row building.
Oh, no, but in Midtown it was the tallest building?
Yes. Yeah.
In the early 1960s, Oxford was working on a master plan for railroad yards called Litho City, American Lithographers Union. That's straight up with the plan. And at the Times printing plant was on West End Avenue between in the 60s. And the paper came in by train rather than by truck. And there was a big ramp or escalator that brought the paper up on an angle and dumped it into the plant. At the time, we decided to do a signature building on the corner of 65th Street, and it was done with the New York Times agreement. The Schultz brother came and looked at the design of this 50-story tower that had a great hole in it, like the project in Miami that came 20 years later, and it was linked to the printing plant. And it was called the New York Times office building. That was the plan. They were going to move out of Times Square and move to the railroad yards behind Lincoln Center. Well, they had a change of heart, and they decided to stay. And then the paper no longer came in by train; it came in by truck. It was delivered right to the building in the 40s, and they stayed there. Their headquarters stayed there, and the project was never built.
This is a really interesting example of the way that the relationship between the paper and its architecture shifts, because it's been in so many different homes. And that would actually be a really wonderful addition to the story, is the building that they didn't build, and how it fits into the story of all the buildings that they were to place that in the chronology as well, because that's really interesting to think about that.
Like LaGuardia, the building that became their printing plant.
I have your fabulous book. It's
Oh, great. Thank you.
I'm embarrassed to say I forget if you talk much about the question that you kind of raised. Idlets and Ox, were they connected socially?
I do not really address that in the book. I have nothing to prove this at all, so this is complete conjecture. But since Ox was Jewish, and Idlet's family was Jewish, Cyrus was himself not Jewish, and actually the descendants of the Idlet's family were shocked to discover that Leopold Idlet's was actually Jewish when he arrived in America. So there's a lot of contention about some of these issues. But Leopold Idlet's was a member of the Century Club. And my feeling is that there was a connection that was made socially through the Century Club that would have made a comfortable association. Cyrus Idlet's was actually blackballed from membership in the AIA after building the Times Tower for reasons that are unknown. I have his application in the rejected. And then 2 years later, he was accepted. His original application was supported by McKim and Meade. And so it's not like he didn't have big names supporting him, but he was nonetheless rejected. So there's some kind of social issue that potentially was a connection between the families. But again, I don't have anything solid to support that.
Well, I guess I would add, I have lots of questions about the Ox's motivations in the tower and just how much has been said. From what I read, there really aren't smoking gun kind of papers that talk about ego or the value of advertising. I mean, there's a little bit. And from doing the research for this exhibition and these early towers, since they represented a different phase, really, of the skyscraper than the buildings that I'm more immured in, which in the 1920s and 30s, and having written a book called Foreign Policy Finance, I like to emphasize the economic value of the buildings as commercial investments. The Times Tower had absolutely no sense. No, it was nonsense as a commercial investment. It was nonsense as a practical, functional factory for producing newspapers, which was at least half of its principal raison d'etre. And it seems to me that the annex is the penance for the extravagance of Ox, to realize how ridiculous it was to think that you could produce a newspaper in this little constricted footprint, which also had no value for a commercial real estate investment because the floor plates were so small. So, you know, it had a rationale in terms of an idea of modernity, perhaps, for distributing the newspaper via the subway, but being conspicuous was its main value. But I wonder if there are letters or sort of ruminations somewhere, or confessions about just what a preposterously egotistical statement, you know, and what business craziness it represented.
I don't have those, but I do know that Cyrus Eidlitz was extremely frustrated by this project and found it to be a very difficult project to work on. I also think that the Chattanooga Times building is a really great indication that this was a project driven by ego, because the Chattanooga Times building absolutely bankrupted Ox. It was a $150,000 six-story building in Chattanooga, which was way too much money. There was a real estate bubble in Chattanooga. The building cost too much. They didn't really need it. I mean, he was willing to spend a lot of money on a building to make a statement. He had that pattern. And the Times Tower is obviously that kind of building. But I do think it's important to think about the fact that the building did do exactly what he wanted it to, which was made the Times the center of attention in a way that had tremendous implications for the newspaper and the way that it was viewed within the city as a kind of public entity, in ways that other newspapers simply never achieved. In which the new New York Times building really doesn't have that same kind of role. Obviously, they didn't maintain their headquarters operations in the Times building when they moved to the annex, but they maintained that building as the Times building until '61. So that connection, kind of psychogeography of the Times was maintained.
But they also kept it as the center of getting the news with the zipper right from the get-go. If you walked around Times Square, you could look up and catch the headlines, and you could do that for centuries.
And as much as Times Square has been transformed, there's still news in there that you can pick out if you feel like it. Yeah.
Did the New York Times come up with the idea of crafting the ball?
Yep, that was their idea. And it was, again, the thing that's really interesting is that was something that happened on the newspaper buildings at City Hall. It was a celebration of the new year every year. And what they tried to do was move that celebration to their own building. And they did it very, very successfully. Yeah.
It might be telling that when they build the Times printing plant out in Brooklyn, he uses Albert Kahn, a great industrial architect. That might be considered overkill. Why couldn't they just, because it's not in a spectacular, it's not. But I have a more curious question. How does someone from Texas get an interest in this building?
I'm trying to think.
And the New York Times.
Well, I went to Williams College, and I've spent a lot of time up here. So I live in Texas, but I get around. I started working on Eidlitz as a graduate student because he's a great neglected figure in the history of American architecture. And his big fat book, The Nature and Function of Art, more especially of Architecture, which if you need something to fall asleep to, is a wonderful candidate. As much as I find that book intriguing, it is heavy, heavy, heavy reading. It's a really amazing document of the one architect's attempt to transform very complex ideas into something that could be used to make architecture in America. So I started working on Leopold, and as I did that, then this is where HLW comes into play. They were very open to me going through their archives. Looking for Leopold Eidlitz drawings, which they don't have any, but I looked through hundreds and hundreds of Ralph Walker drawings. And so it kind of led me to look at the history of their firm. Yes?
I'd like to make an observation. Someone raised a question about the role of ego in building these buildings. There's an absolutely perfect correlation between the egocentricity of the owner of the newspaper and the magnificence of the building. And the Chicago Tribune Tower is the best example of all. the international competition, and something about the Daily News building is another good example, the Times Tower, as opposed to the Hearst buildings like the German American and the Mirror, which are still in existence today and remarkably pedestrian. So it has to do with the ego of the provider. Now, Hearst, of course, had this fabulous building on 57th and 8th, but his newspaper buildings in New York of no notice whatsoever. And when you look around the country, it's always a function of the family that owned the paper.
I think in Ock's case, too, he was attempting to make his reputation based on his newspaper. Not so much as him as an individual, but through the accomplishment that the newspaper represented. And so the lavishness of the spending on the institution itself was a reflection of that personal.
And don't forget, he was not only an out-of-towner, but an immigrant, so he had two barriers he wanted to transcend.
But to take up on the other side of that issue, I think it's important to note that the Annex building, which is where they actually produced the newspaper for far longer, 8 years in the Times Tower, and from 1914 to 1997 on 229 West 43rd Street, that is an expression of his savvy as a business person. And just as Pulitzer and the World may have indulged in their expression of self-promotion and success, it was their business savvy that produced the millions of dollars that allowed them that extravagance. So they weren't doing this because they didn't understand the value of money and how spending money could produce advertising or celebrity or whatever. But it is interesting that business came back in order to prevail over the sort of the flight of fancy that this tower represents.
Yeah.
Get back to the picture there you had of the bell tower, Giotto's bell tower in Florence.
Can we advance to the Campanile?
Why did he use that as the basis for the building?
I
could see some comparison because you have the tapestry, which is short, much lower, and you never notice that, but you do in comparison to the Herald building that was quite, I don't know if it was that or...
By all reports, this was Ock's choice, and he had traveled through Europe, and he really liked this tower. I can also imagine in a way that you go to the top and you have this incredible view across the city below, and it has that kind of effect that he was looking for. But it seems a very odd choice in a lot of ways. And Eidlitz, I think, given that this is what he was supposed to work with, did a pretty good job of trying to unite a single tower with a kind of trapezoidal base. It's an awkward building. And if you look through all of the studies that were done, and Montgomery Schuyler's article is really interesting in its own right as a subject for discussion about Eidlitz's process of looking through and trying to figure out what this mansard roof that he was thinking about, how to design the angles so that it didn't look wrong from any position. And he struggled and struggled and struggled, and he couldn't quite figure it out. So with the final design, it looks a bit awkward in a way from every angle. So in a way, you could say it's finished. It's the Campanile. It's supposed to look that way. But the divisions, if you do go through, you've got the stacking of 1, 2, and then 3, 4, and 5, and you have exactly the same here with the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, and the 5 kind of cubes stacked on top of each other.
Was the observation part public?
No, it does not seem to have been entirely public, although quite a few people did go up there. It was not, from what I can tell, something that you could just go to and go up to the top.
He had special permission.
Yes, absolutely. Invited guests. Yes?
I had a question about the subway delivery system. Did they have their own private subway car? How did that work?
No, they didn't. And that's something I find intriguing too, and I haven't found any really good descriptions of how that worked. But basically the newsboys would take their packets with them, so they weren't loading up a whole car. it was, you know, he would grab his packet and go off to where he sold, and you know, you just get a bunch of newspaper boys hopping onto the subway, and they would beat everyone else, especially to points north, in selling the newspaper. This is a big part of capturing the market.
As we turn the lights up, I think we'll thank Kate and Aubrey.